Test. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Those of you who are still over here in this part, it is time to make your way into this area. You are left with the desirable front row seats. That is your reward, everybody who seated themselves in a timely fashion. My name is Julie Hannes. I am the Director of Communications here at the Institute on the Environment. And it is my pleasure on this sunny, beautiful spring day to welcome you to our second Monday of the spring semester. This is a new convening and event format we've been experimenting here with at the Institute. Here at IonE, we believe that complex problems, this is not a controversial belief, require coming together across disciplines and sectors to have conversation that incorporates different ways of knowing and different perspectives all together. So we wanted to create a physical space to have that type of conversation with all of you. Here's the plug. Tomorrow you're going to be receiving a survey. I hope you will take just a couple of minutes to share your ideas about how we could both use this forum in the future and also improve the forum as you've experienced it today. Is everybody in? Raise your hand if you're going to answer the survey. Yes! You also can get the survey. So right now it's my privilege to introduce our moderator, Kate Brauman. She is a lead scientist here at the Institute. She is the director of our Global Water Initiative, and she is also, not coincidentally, the lead of our Water Impact Goal. These are sustainability objectives that IonE is working to galvanize our whole community around over a 3-year period. We believe that we can have impact here in Minnesota that can be a model for the world. So on that note, Kate has assembled a fantastic panel who's going to talk about source water and drinking water, and I will hand it off to her.
Thank you very much, Julie. I am delighted to be here today with this panel. I want to begin our panel today with an acknowledgement that we are in a place that is a Dakota homeland, and we're talking about water and source water, and the Mississippi is particularly important to Dakota and other Native peoples. So I'm going to put that out there and not attempt to speak Dakota. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming on this gorgeous day. I'm glad the snow apocalypse of April has not hit us just yet. If I say it, maybe it won't happen. We are here, as Julie said, to talk about source water protection. And source water protection is one piece of our new IonE impact goal, focusing on ensuring fresh water, ensuring safe drinking water for all Minnesotans. And I suspect for many of us, when we think about drinking water and safe drinking water, we tend to think about the developing world. We think about cholera outbreaks. We think about open defecation, things that we don't see here in Minnesota. And yet, in Minnesota, we still struggle with making sure that everyone has clean water to drink. And that's true for a whole variety of reasons. We're going to talk about some of those today. And we have a really diverse panel. And part of the reason that I wanted to have such a diverse group of people with different perspectives is because you've probably heard me say this before, if you've heard me talk before, I deeply and truly believe that no one is polluting the water just for fun. We are doing things on the landscape for completely reasonable and understandable reasons, and sometimes that leads to water pollution. And so when we talk about source water protection, we need to think about the whole value chain of what do we do on the landscape and why, as well as some of the biophysical things that happen that cause our water to not be safe to drink. So we're here today. We have a panel of 3 guests, and hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more from them than from me. First, we have Tanny Eschenauer. Tanny is with the Department of Health and is going to bring us some perspectives about what we're actually thinking about when we worry about why water is or isn't safe to drink. We have Jake Youngers, who is with the agronomy department here at the University of Minnesota and has been working on perennial cropping systems as one potential solution for some of the concerns we have about source water. And then we have Emily Vikra, who is an owner of Vikra Distillery up in Duluth. And in addition to being excited about alcohol, I really wanted Emily to be here to give us some perspective on what it means to be an end user of a product that sometimes causes water pollution, which is grain production, as well as a user of water, and what that means trying to think about business and trying to survive financially as well as environmentally. So I'm going to start this panel off with Tanny, and one of the things that I'm hoping that you'll address as you introduce yourself is, what's the problem here? What's going on? Do we really need to be worried about water? We've got a lot of water in front of us. So, Tanny, please take it away.
Okay. So, as Kate said, my name is Tanny, and I got my master's in public health here at the University of Minnesota. So it's great to be back here, even if it's on the St. Paul campus. And following my degree, I went with a lot of head knowledge to East Africa after the years of the Ethiopian famine. And with my husband, together we did village water supply. And it was an incredibly fulfilling experience. But when our oldest was ready to go to college, we came back to Minnesota and ended up staying. And I thought, whatever will I be able to do here that has to do with drinking water? So maybe you're in a similar position now, but we in Minnesota, while we're blessed with incredible water resources, we have to be careful that we don't take them for granted. And we are seeing changing land use in some of our areas that drain to the Mississippi River, for example, that threaten our biggest metropolitan areas. And we know that there's about 80,000 chemicals that we use in everyday life, and when we put those down the drain or we spread them on the land, they don't just go away, they go somewhere. They go into our groundwater. And we have safe drinking water today because the people that came before us invested in things like source water protection and things like treatment infrastructure and things like monitoring. And so we stand, I think, at the edge of a new world in drinking water. We're in a shifting paradigm where the Safe Drinking Water Act has provided us with a tremendous amount of protection. The idea that you can go anywhere in the state of Minnesota, drink from a public water supply, and be pretty sure that it's safe to drink, that's an amazing feat. I don't think that's going to be true into the future. We have contaminants that are not covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act. We have changing land use practices. And frankly, we need to act now. We have a window of time in which we as a community of Minnesotans can take action to protect those source waters. That's where it starts. And I often think that public health and drinking water in particular is largely invisible, but it is not invincible, and we have to take action to protect it.
Thank you, Tanny. So, Jake, agriculture gets a lot of flack in the state of Minnesota when we're talking about water quality. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and why that's happening and what we might do about it?
Yes, definitely. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for inviting me here today. This is great. I think in the media, we often see how agriculture is tied to water quality issues as it relates to surface water. We're aware of soil and nutrients running off our farm fields and ending up in our lakes, rivers, and streams, and we see algal blooms and maybe stained water from the soil that's in these streams. But what we don't often see is the nitrate that's in the groundwater that's coming from agricultural fertilizers and farm fields. So those are both challenges that we're trying to overcome in the Forever Green initiative at the University of Minnesota. So I am one of many there's awesome scientists working on the Forever Green initiative, probably 80 scientists, graduate students, postdocs, and we interact with stakeholders from across the state of Minnesota and beyond to develop new crops and cropping systems to help mitigate those water quality challenges and other environmental issues related to agriculture in the upper Midwest. So the Forever Green Initiative is working on solutions like winter annual crops, which are very similar to maybe cover crops that you might have heard of, except that these winter annual crops have real profitable, marketable products that can be harvested from them. So that's a way that we can prevent some of these surface water issues. If we have a crop growing on the landscape in the winter, it's less likely for soil to run off that field in the spring. Another potential solution that we're working on is perennial crops. You may have heard of Kernza. That's what I work on mostly. It's about to be the world's first commercialized perennial grain crop. And that has lots of environmental issues, as you can imagine. With a perennial crop, you plant it once, it is in the field for multiple years. Farmers don't have to go back into that field and till the soil and replant. It can be harvested for multiple years. So it also has a deep, dense root system that can capture nitrogen from the soil that's already there, which also limits the amount of nitrogen that we have to put on to the crop in the farm field. And that is one way how a perennial crop like Kernza can prevent nitrate from leaching into our groundwater and contaminating our drinking water source.
Great. And Emily, where the rubber meets the road with a lot of this stuff is whether or not someone's willing to buy these crops from farmers, whether or not really who should pay for a lot of things. A lot of that is related to sustainable businesses. You're running a sustainable business, so will you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do that and what that means?
Yeah. So my background is not in alcohol or distilling at all, and neither is my husband, the co-founder of the distillery. Actually, we both come from more of a public health background. I have a PhD in food policy and applied nutrition from Tufts, and he has an MPH. And so we were working in as practitioners and as researchers in public health issues out on the East Coast when we were suddenly struck with this idea that the Lake Superior watershed might be the perfect place to make distilled spirits and convey the terroir of that area with distilled spirits. And maybe that would be a useful platform for talking about and working on the protection of those natural resources and be a way to root back and be part of the community in Duluth, which is where I grew up. And so I kind of took this leap and went from being academics to being entrepreneurs. And so it's been a really awesome and really interesting shift in perspective. And something that I'm really glad that we did at the start of our business was we actually incorporated as something called a triple bottom line business. And so we are board of directors, which is mainly just us, and our investors all agreed that people and planet would also be annual goals in addition to profit. And that is an awesome thing and an awesome way to incorporate if you do have sustainability goals, because there are constantly influences that pull you towards making decisions that you might not want to as like a person to maximize your bottom line, because you're trying to pay your employees and you're trying to afford new equipment and things like that. And so when I think about sustainable business, I think about kind of 3 ways that businesses can work towards promoting sustainability and promoting things like water protection or climate change mitigation action, things like that. I think about cleaning up your own process, so your own action as a business. And for us, we've done that in ways like using only organic agriculture. And for our sourcing, we use glass that is made mainly from recycled glass at a very it's transported from France, so that's not so great, but it's at a factory that has very high standards for carbon emissions and for clean production, things like that. All of our printing and things like that use non-toxic biodegradable inks. We became a zero waste business, I think, a year and a half ago, and so we divert more than 90% of our products or our waste away from landfill and mainly into compost. Honestly, there's a lot of bio waste, and we introduced a water loop, a closed water loop for our process water. Distilling uses water in the process of making the product for the liquid part, but there's also a lot of processed water because distilling involves a lot of heating up and cooling down and heating up and cooling down. And so we used Duluth's wonderful, very cold ambient temperature to our advantage, and we have our water as a closed loop so that after it heats up, it runs outside and gets cooled back down through a glycol chiller, which most of the year does not require any extra energy, actually. So there's cleaning up your own act. There is advocacy. I think businesses can do a better job of advocating both for kind of cultural shifts towards sustainability and doing a lot of communication about that, and also being better voices for regulation and actually accepting regulation and championing smart regulation as ways of leveling the playing field and distributing the costs so that everybody's paying for them and it's not just like the environment. And I think that businesses can also be a force for innovation. Nobody had to regulate away people's landlines for their phone. The iPhone came along and everybody naturally made the switch because it was an innovation that people wanted. And I think we can see some of the same things for sustainability and businesses and potentially businesses in partnership with like research facilities, I think can really move the needle forward in making change.
Fabulous. So I'm going to ask all of you this same question, but Emily, we can start with you. I'm curious about some of your unexpected challenges. So we had the opportunity to chat a little bit before this panel, and one of the things you brought up is the fact that you are not a giant conglomerate business. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that and what that's meant and any other unexpected challenges that you've come across.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I hope turns out to actually be an opportunity, maybe for someone here, is as a medium-sized business, there aren't a lot of great technical solutions for more sustainable manufacturing options. Just with our closed water heating and cooling loop, we actually wound up basically building that and making it ourselves. And we worked with like NRI at the U in Duluth, and we worked with some engineering firms, but the solutions that existed kind of ready to go were either really tiny or they're just huge for places that have like hundreds of thousands of times the production capacity that we have. And we've seen the same type of things for like our electricity generation. We looked at solar, which just isn't an option for our size because we won't be able to pay it back fast enough. And so for like a really small place that doesn't need a ton of energy, or for a really huge business that is going to see the payback within like less than a year, there are better options. But when you're medium sized, the financing doesn't work out as well. And we also looked at seeing if we could use our waste for biogas generation. But again, you can get really, really small generators, or you can get things that are really, really huge where we would have to take 50 of the breweries and distilleries from Minnesota and all like put our waste together to try to use one of these generators. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for creating technical solutions that are more medium-sized so that medium-sized businesses can take advantage of them. And I think also potentially for like financing, I would love to see some type of institution that like financed and maybe even provided technical support for putting in equipment that was more sustainable.
So Jake, what about on field? Are there unexpected challenges that you've come across as you have been working in this area of developing new crops?
Yeah, definitely. And some of these also relate to scale, like your issues as well. So we have really good data from these smaller plot scale research plots that have been distributed across the state that show that Kernza is pretty good at capturing nitrate before it enters the groundwater. But phase 2 is to really demonstrate that this works at a larger scale on farms. So that's what we're doing right now, is working with real farmers, instrumenting those fields, growing Kernza, monitoring the results in terms of nitrate leaching and water quality. But there's another side of this coin in terms of scale, and that is economics and profitability. So you can find Kernza products here in the Twin Cities at small scale. You can go to Bang Brewery and get a pint of beer with Kernza in it. I think you can get waffles at Birchwood Cafe with Kernza. But that medium scale is a little bit more difficult. And now there's also been interest from General Mills. So that's the other end of the spectrum, large scale. So General Mills can't work with a few thousand pounds of Kernza. They need hundreds of thousands of pounds of Kernza. And right now we're at that hundreds of pounds working with these smaller scale restaurants and breweries. So getting from that small scale to the large scale in terms of supply chain and economics, that's definitely necessary to see this new crop expand on the landscape, to actually realize those environmental benefits that are possible.
So Tanny, have you had unexpected challenges?
Yes, quite a few, but I'll just tell you about two. One, I think, is just a lack of knowledge and awareness about drinking water and where does it come from. In Ethiopia, when we got there, the government had just made an edict that everyone had to leave their traditional homestead and move into centralized villages. And the uproar was about, well, where will we get our water from? That was question number one. When I came to Minnesota in the summer at the State Fair, I love to work in the Eco Experience building and ask Minnesotans who are very shy coming through there, can I answer a question? No. Can I ask you one? Yes. Where does your drinking water come from? A bottle, a factory, and for the farm community, to give them credit, they're the ones that know their water comes from a private well, but the folks that live in the city aren't always aware, and I think actually the suburbanites are guilty often. So where do we start with a public, with a community of Minnesotans who aren't aware of where their drinking water is coming from? That's one unexpected challenge for someone fresh back from Africa. And then the other is the challenge of integrating. Drinking water in the state of Minnesota is in the Minnesota Department of Health, a public health agency. We have water responsibilities and authorities distributed throughout the executive branch. And when you look at the intersection of public health and natural resource management, it really is most clearly in the area of source water protection. We don't have the authorities and the responsibilities, the power, the regulations in order to protect source water. So we really need to be very intentional and thoughtful about working with our sister agencies in the executive branch and working with nonprofit groups to do source water protection, to work with businesses to do source water protection. It really is going to require an extensive collaboration in order to protect those source waters.
Thank you, all of you, for those perspectives. So I hope that this is starting to drum up questions for all of you. I'm going to ask our panelists one more question, then I'm going to turn it over. So that means that the quality of this discussion really lands on you. My expectations are high. So I was struck by this idea of not knowing where your water comes from. And in some ways, that seems to me really connected to this idea that we should be able to turn our taps on and trust the water that comes out. And that feels to me like an entitlement, but a really good entitlement, one that I want to share with everyone. And yet, it's also potentially a really expensive entitlement, and the responsibility for it lies in a lot of places potentially. So I'm curious about responsibility and equity and how all three of you see those themes running through your work as you think about protecting source water.
No, you should go first.
That's a tough question. Sorry. Well, I think that a basic level of protection and access to drinking water is a fundamental human right, even though it's not in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know how that happened. I think that is a very challenging thing in a situation where costs are not equally distributed and not everyone is able to pay. So For example, we see some really serious inequities when people have to pay to take contamination out of drinking water, which they didn't profit from. They didn't benefit from that use that sent that into their drinking water. In Minnesota, we have a rural-urban divide where you don't have the broad customer base in order to distribute your costs. So if I'm in a town that has 100 people and I have to put on nitrate treatment, that's a really formidable obstacle. And there are rules and expectations about how much of your household income should be spent on water and wastewater, but that percentage is growing in greater Minnesota. That's a challenge for us. And I could list some more, but I'll share the mic with my panelists.
Yeah. When we think about this potential solution of changing the landscape with new crops to overcome this issue, there's also we have to consider equity as well. So I think this one's fading in and out. So I'll switch with you. Yeah, so if we have new crops and new products being made available to the public, we have to think about how those are distributed and what kind of marketable products they end up in. So for instance, maybe we want to make sure that Kern's is not just going to go into beer, where a select socioeconomic group can access it. We want to make sure that it's an ingredient that can be used in a variety of different products that's available to everyone. And another element of that is making sure that we can produce it profitably, but that it's not an especially expensive product. So we're working hard to increase grain yields and making sure that this can be competitively priced with some of our annual crops. And all of this is still tied back to making sure that I can be placed on the landscape in these vulnerable areas, these wellhead protection areas, and can be grown there economically viably, so that we can indeed achieve these goals of mitigating nitrate contamination.
Yeah, it's a huge question. It's so important, and I think it's really interesting. Where my mind immediately goes is regulation, because I think people do have an expectation in this country that if they get water out of their faucet, it should be safe. Like, that seems reasonable. We're a developed country. At the same time, it requires a lot of regulation to accomplish that, and people have developed this very anti-regulatory attitude. Regulations have been spun as like so bad for your freedom and so bad for business, and so there's this kind of all regulation is anti-business sentiment, and I think that regulations can be hard on businesses for sure. It's not fun to do the paperwork. It's not fun to pay for certain things for sure, and it can make it harder to do business, but I think a lot of it is being driven by really, really huge entities that have a lot of money and a lot of political influence, and that by undoing these regulations, these large entities are really damaging the public health, and the public is the one who's bearing the brunt of that cost. And I think that we, especially for something like the safety of drinking water, I mean, the economy, if you're having a free market economy or whatnot, it relies on either transparency, or if you don't know exactly what is going into something, it has to be regulated. Otherwise, you can't make good decisions for your purchasing and whatnot if you don't see exactly what's going into something. And so you need to have regulations to correct that market failure. And so I think, some work needs to be done with education, with some sentiment shifting, and some more businesses saying, actually, it's good to be regulated because it creates a more level playing field in some ways for businesses, because then it's not just people who are saying, yes, I will, as a business, pay more money to be responsible because I care about the public, and then their products are being bought because they're more expensive, and people are buying the more convenient, cheaper products from the companies that are cutting corners. Everybody is at least at the same standard of responsibility, and maybe the price of products goes up, which again is there are some equity issues there, but I think, yeah, we need to look at some cultural shifts towards less but better consumption. That was a lot of.
All right. So what are you curious about?
Kim's coming. She's coming and she'll bring you the mic. There's
We can record it then.
Okay.
It's a very short and kind of dumb question. Can you spell Kernza, please? I have probably read it, but I have not heard it.
Kernza. Kernza.
That's how I spelled it. Yes.
And you get to move to the next round.
Yes.
Hello, so I'm Andrew. I've got kind of a statement that leads into maybe an open question, which is having coming like from work for SC Johnson, which is a very, very large chemical company. I think the scale is such an important and underappreciated aspect. And when we talk about business, to me, I don't even consider what SC Johnson does or other large corporations of their size to be even in the same realm of things as what, you refer to yourself as a medium-sized business, but the orders of, there's not one order of magnitude between what you do and what they do. There are many orders of magnitude. And they throw around the triple bottom line. Let's talk about people, planet, what a profit. But at the end of the day, I was on the inside of running analyses, and I saw which one won out most of the time. And I also know what they do in terms of helping to shape our perceptions, our culture around regulation's bad for business, for everyone, as if it's all the same thing. And I even worry, too, is like from the Evergreen Initiative, just as you brought up, there aren't solutions for medium-sized businesses. There aren't solutions for diversifying the activity we do, because even research now, as much as our media has been captured by large businesses, our research is being captured by large businesses to give solutions to them and not to those who we need. I don't know if you guys have any. And then even one third point to open it also to you is you brought up the rising cost of water in our budgets. We know that people's productivity has tripled, but we've gotten an 11% raise over the last 40 years. So this, again, the size of business, I think. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have answers, sadly. More just similar observations where I think there has been, our whole economy has shifted, and there has been a lot of aggregation and a lot of merging, and businesses have either become huge, mind-bogglingly huge entities with massive amounts of power and massive environmental and social impact, or they tend to be very small, like 2 to 5 person businesses, and they're increasingly few, if you can have increasingly few, businesses that are in that 25 to 150 person size business range. And you see that with farms also. There's either these tiny scale farms or there's these massive entities. There's not a lot of small. And you're seeing it with towns. There aren't a lot of medium size towns that have the things that they need to survive as towns. There's either giant cities or there's these rural areas. And it's this general shift. And I think that we need some type of reckoning, unfortunately, to shift back. And I think some of it is going to have to be political. But right now, the large entities have so much political influence that I think I just saw a study that shows that there's literally no correlation between public support of something and the likelihood that it will be passed as a federal bill. And so I think maybe on more local and state level scale, you can start to get some more political action to kind of undo some of the merging of large businesses and to undo some of that power and to support more diverse economic development in different areas. Like, we got caught up in a massive conflict up in Duluth about the mines on the range, and talking about the economics of that. And because the only economic calculus that gets talked about is whether the people there will get the jobs and get that mining money on the range. Nobody talks about how the pollution that will come from that will influence the water and the other businesses that are there and all the businesses that rely on fresh water. And nobody really will talk about how that further prevents economic diversification on the range. It just continues to rely on one like large corporation from outside of the range, instead of looking at how can we grow more sustainable, more diverse economic inputs here. So I don't have an answer. But there needs to be some fighting happening, possibly.
I don't speak on behalf of the Kernza research team for the Forever Green Initiative, not all the Kernza crops, but we literally started by taking 5-gallon buckets of Kernza seed, dumping it in a dehauler, bagging that up, throwing in the back of my colleague's Prius, and driving it to Bang Brewery. That was the supply chain, and that's how it started. Terribly inefficient. It just does not work. But that's how it started, and that's how Kernza got out into the marketplace in the Twin Cities. And obviously, there are major advantages to economy of scale when you increase. But there are concerns around that, the equity issues, when we take the leap from one scale to the next. And we're very conscious of that and thinking about that. And really, one area that we can address in moving that scale meter is the messaging, and making sure that our corporate partners have the same message as those who are intimately connected with researching this product and this grain. So that's really what we're focusing on, is that message, to make sure that the consumers who are consuming the product from those corporations understand why this is a beneficial crop.
So you talked about the income issue. I probably don't have to say anything more about that, but I can think of 3 areas where in the business world we're looking for help. One is, as they design their products, can they do it with an idea about where they end up? So a big challenge for us in our drinking water sources is pharmaceuticals and personal care products. If you're downstream of a wastewater treatment plant, not everybody's at the head of the watershed. So can they design pharmaceuticals so that the human body metabolizes more of it and less is excreted? Another area is in supply chain and social responsibility. In Minnesota, through the Department of Ag, you can be certified for water quality, that you have had your field walked, your farm, every field walked, to make sure that you're doing everything you can to keep from contaminating water. Could we get a label on our product at Cub so that would say this product was grown on this farm that has the Minnesota Ag Water Quality certification on it? I would look for that. I was buying barely chicken after the day after I found out about it. So that's 2 areas, and I'm probably going to forget the 3rd one, but
We can come back to you.
yeah, if I can remember it later on.
Other questions?
We've got a question, wow, it's loud, from the Cannon River Watershed Partnership. How do you see the role of nonprofits playing specifically in protecting source drinking water around municipal wells, for example?
Okay, well, in one, I think they have a role that is not regulatory, and they are often a voice that people will respond to in a way that they don't respond to big government or when they see overreach. I think they have a especially important role in bringing communities together and having discussions, and real change can take place as communities discuss, well, what do we value? And what do we value in our water? And how can we come together around our municipal well, around our community water supply to protect it? What needs to happen in order for that to take place? And then on the state level, we really value the work that we have with nonprofits when we go to the legislature, because they're an important voice for us. They say things that we can't say in the executive branch, and they can speak very boldly, and so we really depend on those voices. Have you interacted with nonprofits at all?
Yeah, definitely. So we work with these nonprofits to identify on-farm partners to test, do some of these on-farm experiments and test these new crops. So they're really critical relationships, and they can also help us get a better idea of the broader ecosystem in that region. So not just growing the crop, but what the market might be like. What are the supply chain opportunities in that region, in that watershed? So those have been really valuable partnerships.
What? Oh, well, it is interesting. And we actually work closely with the St. Louis River Alliance up in Duluth, and my husband is now on the board of it. And I do think that that role of being a non-government voice, but a voice that is still kind of promoting certain responsibility and of bringing community together to really have the discussions is incredibly important, because you can do all the education in the world, but knowledge alone does not alter behavior. And so really furthering those discussions so that people have that personal connection, they can connect it to why it matters to them, to bring action.
So my question is about Kernza. Can you give us a little better understanding of the benefits to these things that we're talking about, like water? So if instead of, a winter wheat crop of 80 acres, you had Kernza, what the difference is? In a lot of these things, we're interested in sustainability, like so nitrogen runoff, savings of carbon from fewer trips over the field. I don't really have a sense for the scale of difference, how big a deal it is.
Yeah. So maybe you've seen this massive picture of the roots, Kernza roots going 9 feet below the soil surface. So a lot of the benefits are tied to these roots. Those roots are about 44% carbon. So there is a lot more carbon below ground in the roots than most of our annual crops like wheat. And then that carbon can be sequestered deeper in the soil than it would be with an annual crop. So when we do happen to go and plow the kerns up, if it's in part of a rotation, that carbon that's a little bit deeper may not be affected. So that's one way that the Kernza can benefit carbon sequestration, but it also can help build soil health. Because we're not tilling the field every year, you allow for soil aggregates to form and to be more stable than if you have to go in and plow every year before you reseed. And then the other benefit to the deep, dense roots is that, as I mentioned before, you don't have to apply as much nitrogen fertilizer, because those roots are really good at capturing the nitrogen that you do apply to it. It's just more efficient at capturing that. So less is leached into the groundwater. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Broberg. I'm the director of the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. I want to challenge you about changing a narrative here. I'm a geologist, worked for 30 years as a consultant, involved in the LCCMR, a number of things. And for too long, we've been using an entry point for people to these water discussions that's too complicated. And I think Professor Kalo and Ann Lewandowski introduced an idea to me just a week ago about water safety plans. And talking through this narrative from the perspective of a kitchen sink, or understanding the tap, and testing our water and knowing what that is. And I want to give you a really, what I think is a poignant example. We're now talking about a GEIS for the karst. I went to the meeting a week ago tonight. 200 people, and we lose the crowd when we talk about karst. We're asking them to be in an entry point that is the most mysterious of things. And we lose most of the participants. But if we were to change this narrative and talk about safe drinking water plans and get people to focus on their tap water, do the test or understand the test results that you have and assess it all the way back to the source, I think we would have a bigger impact. I've done a lot of work in the legislature over the years, and there's no way I can cut a slice of the legislature out and find a majority that understands source water protection. There is no majority opinion there. They don't know what we're talking about. They think it's modeling and mysterious and academic. But there's not a single one that will go home and deny that they want safe drinking water at their tap. And I think 2 or 3 of you already said that. So I really want to challenge everybody here to drop that language. Let's not talk anymore about source water protection. Let's talk about safe drinking water plans and put together a realistic action plan about how that can be done. The university group here working on the future of drinking water is going down that path and has a really good format for this, and it's something that's been used around the world. But we're just dropping people into the wilderness, asking them to understand karst. We're not getting there, and we're going to fail if we don't change the narrative.
So I thought I would just say to Jeff, you are singing out of my hymn book, and I really appreciate your saying that, and I think a fundamental communication principle is to start where people are, and that really is what comes out of their tap. And what we find over and over again is that communities get energized when they've faced contamination because that threat has become very real. So yeah, point well taken.
Emily or Jake, have either of you thought much about this narrative and the communication of how you're talking about your concerns on field or as a small business, and sort of how that has or hasn't worked in terms of communication?
When we can relate these issues to the farmer's kitchen sink, yes, it goes a long way. And then it really helps captivate their interest in these new crops. So definitely. But going beyond that, thinking about communicating what perennial crops are to the general consumer, that is a challenge. And what it means to be perennial and the environmental benefits that could come with that. That's something we're trying to tackle as well.
I mean, we have not been super involved in the overall narrative of like how people think about their well water, weirdly enough. Although it does make me think that so much of the conversation also has to come down to like, do people even perceive a threat? I most of the time don't think about it, and it doesn't seem like a threat. And so I think we have to think very carefully about like, how do we galvanize people with the threat before the threat is there? And how do you galvanize people rather than threaten them so much that they shut down and go into the fear control response rather than the control of the threat? And so talking about that and talking about the realities of the threat, but also the realities of there are ways to deal with it. When we think about communication, we think more about generally from like an advertising standpoint, and to what extent do we communicate and advertise our actions as a business? And I think that's a really interesting question, because there is so much, there is a lot of spin and there's a lot of greenwashing from different companies. And so there can be the perception that it's all talk and no action. And so you have to be aware of that. And there also has often been a perception, I think, among people where if you're getting something that's more sustainably produced, there's some trade-off and it's going to be lower quality. And so relating quality to your production standards and showing that because you're producing something more responsibly, it is higher quality and worth the higher price, and that higher price is also paying more people who are your neighbors to have a good job is one way that we want to communicate about it. And then I think also, I don't remember who it was who brought up, like, would it be helpful to have numbers? I think the more like actual numbers you have, to be like, we saved this number of pounds of carbon, or we saved this many gallons of water by doing this way, I think is a precise and convincing way to communicate. But then you also have to keep it a little bit fun, because you don't want to turn people off by being like, we all have to make really good decisions all the time. So trying to make doing good a little bit more fun is also part of the calculus.
I can just say, we adopted a new tagline at our board meeting. Keep your eye on the tag.
So, back to Kate's initial point is that nobody wants to pollute water just for the sake of polluting water, right? We all want to do the right thing. And I know many farmers are in that boat as well. And they are concerned when they turn on their faucet, and they are concerned when they see, all of this pond scum. But for them, where the rubber hits the road is their machinery. In order to do these new technologies, in order to have these cover crops, in order to have of crops, to have different machinery. They need to be able to afford this different machinery, or they need to be able to retrofit their current machinery in order to be able to use this kind of new technology or use these different types of crops. And I was wondering, is there anything on the horizon where people can get access to these types of things? So any illumination would be very helpful.
So I'll just start off because it kind of piggybacks on what Jeff was saying about the narrative. There's a dominant narrative that goes on in our culture, in our society, a public discourse about these things, and that has put a target on the back of the farmer. And that's very unfair because it's not realistic. Farmers are one cog in a very large system. And you read a headline in the newspaper that nitrate contamination is just part of the cost of doing business. We have to change that narrative. In other parts of the world, they don't have this environmental degradation goes hand in hand with economic development kind of worldview. And so we need to start thinking about what are ways that we can prosper the farmer and protect our resources, our groundwater, our surface water. And we have to take a systemic approach. I sometimes tease my colleagues in other agencies saying, you think a BMP a day will make the bad water go away. Well, that's not sustainable. We can't pay people to do the right thing. We have to change the system that drives farmer choices and limits farmer choices. I remember when Governor Dayton went to Morris, one of the women farmers said this certain piece of equipment cost more than her house. And then she explained how the seed is tied to the pesticide and the fertilizer is tied to the equipment, is tied to transportation, to a processing facility, and transportation to a market, and then there has to be a market. So we can't just look at one point in that system. We have to look at the whole thing and realize that each of us participates in this system, and how do we change the system? And I think that's the hope of Kernza, is that that will be a first step in changing the broader system.
Yeah, another point to make is that there's no silver bullet for any of this. We need to have a suite of options for growers, a catalog to go through what's going to work for his farm. That it's going to include things like conservation tillage, precision ag of nitrogen fertilizer, new annual crops that fit into our existing corn and soybean system, and then even more new crops that are brand new and novel. So really providing lots of different options to make headway slowly. So.
I just, want to say I do think like some type of better financing setup that was not designed to just profit off of financing farmers and businesses, but was almost more like a small business administration, except hopefully with less paperwork, that provides financing for making these changes. Because it is true, you make that investment, and then you're like, well, I'm never going to be able to change because I bought this piece of equipment, and that is my life now. And yeah, it's not like they want to be polluting, but you are so invested on a day-to-day basis that you feel like stuck.
That mic seems to be going a little wonky. It was turned off. Just kind of a quick question with the longer answer is, under the idea that the states are a place to really experiment and learn and try new stuff on the public policy avenue, and since this legislative session is going on right now, is maybe look for each of you, like at the state level, the agency level, at crop production level, and at the business level, what are some of the innovations that we need at state level on policy?
Does anybody want to start?
There are certain agricultural policies that could help growers adopt some of these new winter annuals. So currently, there's some regulations around crop insurance that could make their summer annuals, like corn and soybeans, that make them not be, what is the word? They couldn't be eligible, thank you. They couldn't be eligible with some of these winter crops. So we need to work on some of those policies. And then there's no crop insurance for some of our new crops coming online. But fortunately, the United States Risk Management Agency is collecting data on Kernza and hopefully some of the other new crops soon, so that there will be packages in the near future.
So one thing we haven't talked about today, because we're talking about source water protection, is the protection that private well owners have. And in the state of Minnesota, we don't have good protection for private well users. So that's something that we're looking at as what kind of policy changes could there be? Could there be a requirement that when a property is sold, as part of that process, you wouldn't just have to notify them that there's a well on the property, but there would have to be a water quality test so that that new owner would be aware that they have a well and what the quality of that water is. Another challenge, I think, is for communities, city water supplies, whose drinking water supply management area, the area that they need to protect in order to protect their drinking water aquifer, sometimes the boundary of that is outside the boundary of the municipality. So they have no jurisdiction, no authority. And so what are tools that we can put into their hands so that they can protect those areas as well?
I don't have anything specific, but I keep thinking about just regulations that require environmental assessments and clean water and water pollution assessments to take into account predicted changes from climate change as well. That feels kind of personal because we were flooded this last fall, like in our space from a huge storm that basically flooded Canal Park, and we're seeing threats to water and to our sewage systems on a level that we haven't seen before, and so making sure that people are required to plan ahead.
There's a question up in the peanut gallery.
My question is related to the Kernza and just perennial grains in general. I'm like a permaculture guy, if you guys are aware of what that means. So when I think of perennial crops, I think of perennial tree crops. And in terms of carbon storage and longevity of the plant in general, I see those not competing with Kernza, but another opportunity. I'm just curious what, Jacob, you think about perennial tree crops. Are they at odds with Kernza, or can they be worked in tandem? Or you kind of made a comment about a suite of solutions rather than a silver bullet, so that's kind of what made me think about it. So just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, in the Forever Green initiative, we have a section on woody perennials, and they do function very differently from like a perennial grain. and we think there's a lot of value in expanding those across Minnesota. So hazelnuts, elderberry, those are two of the main woody perennials in the program. And when we think about Kernza as a perennial crop, it's a very long-lived plant, but it really only produces grain at a level that's economically viable for about 3 years right now. We're trying to expand that, but it can very well be thought of as a crop in a rotation with other crops. So, yeah, again, providing lots of different options for growers.
Jake, can you just provide a little more context for us about crop breeding and getting to something that's economically viable and how long that takes and sort of why you're at where you're at with these new crops?
Definitely. It's a long story, but I'm going to try to cut to the chase. So we've been breeding Kernza for about almost 20 years now. The first 15 years, a lot of that breeding was done at the Land Institute in Kansas. University of Minnesota has had its program since about 2011. And we've been able to make really rapid advancements because of the genomic technology we have. So we now have, not to get too deep into the genetics, but we have a map of the genome essentially, and we can identify which parts control which traits, so we can make advancements on specific traits really rapidly. So that's what's so exciting about this right now, is that we're in the honeymoon phase of domesticating a wild plant to serve and function as a crop. We're seeing advancements that are 3 to 4 times faster than we see with most of our conventional annual crops. So that's why we're able to make advancements so quickly, and we see this continuing for the next 10, 15, maybe even 20 years.
My question is about what is a fair trade? What is it fair to ask a recipient of these public dollars? Tanny talked about small rural towns. Well, they're essentially asking more populous cities to underwrite their water treatment. We asked about farmers getting new equipment. We talked about distillers helping find some, or not necessarily, medium-sized companies find ways to incorporate some of these cost-saving technologies. What's a fair ask of the public sector? Say, in return for the money that we've given you for this, what can we ask of these recipients?
Well, I think of a question that we have before the legislature right now, and that we have our safe drinking water fee, or our service water connection fee. So everyone who's connected to a public water supply for a community pays a whopping $6.36 a year, not a month. And that's passed through to the Department of Health. And first, when I came to the health department, I thought, well, Minneapolis and St. Paul, they pay the largest amounts because they have the largest number of connections. But as I've worked at the department and I've seen how those dollars are used, I see, yes, someone living in Minneapolis pays that $6.36, and these systems already have a lot of resources and technical capacity. But what it means is that when that person goes to Thief River Falls, or goes to a resort in Brainerd, or goes down to Whitewater State Park, they can be assured that they're drinking safe water. So that $6.36, which we hope becomes $9.72 if it makes it through the bill process, it's a promise that you can go anywhere in the state of Minnesota, drink from a public water supply, and do that in confidence.
We have another question online. What can I do as a consumer to encourage the growth of the market of Kernza? Is the Forever Green Initiative accepting investors?
No, there have definitely been investment interests, and I would point the person to the Land Institute probably first. They hold the trademark for the name Kernza. But just consumers being aware that when you buy something with the Kernza stamp on it, It has certain standards, that it's not just seed harvested from any old perennial grass, that there are environmental standards and quality standards that come with it. So that's something that I hope that consumers are aware of, and that we have to work on in terms of messaging and communication to make sure that that comes with the product.
So I want to be cognizant of all of your time, and thank you for coming out today, and cognizant of our panel's time. So I'm going to close out the panel by asking our panelists about one thing that you're really excited about in the future of tap water protection. Safe tap water.
Well, I have two grandsons, Ethan and Micah, and they're 7 and 5, and I am very excited about the Clean Water Fund and the promise that is for them, that someday I don't have to worry about whether they'll be drinking safe drinking water, because Minnesotans today paid that extra 0.3% sales tax in order for us to invest now for drinking water for the future.
We're starting a project this fall in central Minnesota around the Cold Spring region, and I'm excited for the opportunity to have a pint of beer from Beaver Island Brewery that has Kerns in it, that was grown in a wellhead protection area in Stearns County. So that's what I'm excited about.
I'm excited to someday distill Kernza. And I think I am excited about conversations like these, and the fact that it is coming more and more into the public dialogue, and the hope that the more we talk about it, the more ideas get thrown into the hopper, and the more will come of it.
Well, first, can we give our panelists a hand? Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for coming today, and everyone who's online. I hope that you are full of questions and ideas. You're welcome to mill and ask questions and talk to us, but I hope that you will keep coming back to IonE, reach out to all of us, and keep this conversation going, because it sounds like there's a lot happening and we have lots of opportunities and a long way to go. Thank you.